All right, so welcome everybody to the League of Women Voters Dane County virtual forum on Revenge of the Marshes, Part 2. Our Climate Crisis Committee, as part of League of Women Voters, has put on several fora during the last year, all related to climate change. We had a forum about public health effects of climate change. We had a forum about the role of local government in climate change mitigation and adaptation. We had a forum about the promise of ag stewardship with respect to climate change. And all of these are available, the recordings are available on the League of Women Voters Dane County website. In the spring, we had a forum called Revenge of the Marshes, which was all about stormwater, flooding, and had a little bit more emphasis on hydrology and the basic science behind flooding problems. And now we're revisiting that topic in a little bit different format, a little more of a discussion about personal experiences, and also including the background of meteorologic background related to flooding. So welcome to our virtual forum today. I'd like to introduce the participants. First, I should say my name is Carol Barford, and I'm a member of the Climate Crisis Forum Committee. I'm very glad to be here today and facilitate the discussion. So first of all, one of our participants is Gail Shea, and Gail is a member of League of Women Voters, and she also serves on several environmental and civic groups, including the board of the Foundation for Dane County Parks. Gail lives in Middleton on the west side of Pheasant Branch Conservancy, and in fact, her house is only about 75 meters away from the creek. So Gail witnessed firsthand the devastation of the flooding there 2 years ago, August 2018. Our second participant is Greg Armstrong. Greg has focused his career on cultivating relationships between humans and nature. He grew up in the historic village of Cooksville, Wisconsin, where his parents owned the general store. He holds a bachelor's in horticulture from UW-Madison and also studied at the Royal Gardens in Kew, UK, and holds a master's degree in botany from Smith College in Massachusetts. There he served with the college botanical gardens and also taught horticulture. He came out of retirement as the director emeritus of the Arboretum here at UW, and he's now the director of land management and environmental education at the Holy Wisdom Monastery in Westport. And last but not least is our own Ralph Petersen, who's part of the Climate Crisis Committee. Ralph developed an early awareness and abiding interest in the environment while he was growing up on a small dairy farm and attending a one-room schoolhouse in southeastern Wisconsin. He received his PhD in meteorology from UW and spent most of his career at NASA and the National Weather Service, where his work was recognized with the Department of Commerce's second highest award, the Individual Silver Medal. He's a fellow of the American Meteorological Society, and he works part-time now as a senior scientist at UW's Space Science and Engineering Center, focusing on improving short-range predictions of severe thunderstorms and heavy rain events. It's right in the wheelhouse for today, Ralph. So first of all, I would like to ask Gail to tell us a little bit about her experiences a couple of years ago.
Okay, this is a picture of the creek, Pheasant Branch Creek, under ordinary circumstances. Now, I live very close to the creek. I have a wonderful opportunity to be able to walk in that conservancy on a regular basis, and just enjoy the opportunity to engage with nature. Now, that August, that night of that big storm, I could hear this roar coming out of the conservancy, and I knew it must be the water just absolutely surging down that creek. And then the next morning, when we went out and looked at it, you could just see the devastation. That's a little footbridge. It was pushed completely off its moorings. It had all this debris against it, and it just flooded out the whole area. Now, I'm north of Century Avenue, and so it's pretty flat there, and it was just water everywhere. All the trails were washed out, all the boardwalks were washed out, And it was just devastating to see it. But that was nothing compared to the damage that was done on the south side of Century Avenue, where the channel is a little narrower, and just huge erosion was happened down there. And then even the commercial area west of Highway 12, which had been built on filled-in wetland, where Costco is, the water came up there so fast and was so high that people actually had to spend the night at Costco. They couldn't get out. So this was just a devastating flood, both in the Conservancy and in the commercial area. And it was just so sad to see it.
It was pretty shocking at that time. So, Greg, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about what role the landscape was playing in that whole series of events.
Well, the landscape of south central Wisconsin, where we live, was previous to European settlement in the 1840s, was mostly prairie and savanna and some woodland, savanna being the most common thing that was in our area. The indigenous people, and in our case, the Ho-Chunk, lived in a sustainable relationship with that landscape and made their living by hunting, and also had their own agriculture, but they did not make dramatic changes to the landscape. Then after the settlement, starting mostly in the 1830s and 1840s in our area, right after the government had surveyed the land and then they sold it pretty cheaply, why most of the land then turned into agricultural land. And there were some small settlements. Middleton was one of them that was pretty early on. And then, as you know, over all of the time in between, there has been kind of an intensification of the way in which we do agriculture. There's been urban development, which has increased with the human population, and paving of roads and parking lots and other hard surfaces. And so this landscape really has changed rather dramatically over a long period of time. And now the whole thing has been aggravated by the changes that have taken place because of climate change and the very strong storms and erosion, and the devastating things like the one that Gail just spoke about.
So, Greg, I wonder if you can talk about how we can help control flooding given the landscape that we have now.
Well, because of the dramatic changes that have taken place in the landscape over all these years, one of the things is to preserve those few natural lands that we still have. That's kind of the thing that the Nature Conservancy does, and does very well. And there's another organization called the Prairie Enthusiasts that does a wonderful job of preserving the prairies. But the amount of these natural lands left is like way less than 1% of what it had been in the past. So something rather significant happened at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum back in the 1930s. And that was that they decided to develop this arboretum, and they came up with this extraordinary idea of making the attempt to reassemble or put back together these whole ecological communities, such as prairies and savannas, wetlands, woodlands, all of the different ecological communities. And this is represents, I think, a rather dramatic change in the human relationship with the land, in that we are attempting, rather than extract something from it, but to reassemble and put the thing back together again so that all of the beings that belong to those natural communities will have a place to live, and we can share that space with them. So ecological restoration is one of the ways in which that can happen. There's now a Society for Ecological Restoration, which I think had its start at the Arboretum, but now it's an international organization, is supporting people who are doing ecological restoration all around the globe. So that is one of the most important things that we can do to increase the amount of natural land. And when you have those natural lands, they're perennial plants as opposed to annual things that you have on the farm, and it slows down the water, it infiltrates the water, and in general increases the health of the land and cuts down on stormwater runoff and whatnot. One can also do rain gardens, which is another way in which people can kind of contribute to making the land work by restoring the ecological services. You're not going to, in a rain garden, you don't restore a whole ecological community, but you put back some plants that will sustain this periodic inundation, and also have a basin where the water can collect and infiltrate, recharging the aquifer, and also then kind of more slowly kind of metering out any of the water that is a runoff.
So thanks, Greg, for that primer on the role of the land. I imagine we'll come back to that later. But for right now, I want to ask Ralph about that other component of flooding, the rainfall. Ralph, can you please tell us a little bit about the meteorologic aspects of flooding?
Thank you, Carol. And thank you, Greg. The major point that Greg made is that if you have a flood, you have a lot of rain, and that rain comes from thunderstorms for the most part. And there is a difference that we have to remember between really severe thunderstorms, the tornado-producing thunderstorms, and gully washers, the heavy precipitation storms. The most severe thunderstorms don't produce that much rainfall in general. They are very dynamically intense, but they produce much less rain than the gully washers, which tend to be less intense thunderstorms, maybe not even with much lightning and thunder associated with them, but they are heavy rain producers and they move very slowly. So they continue to get a lot of fuel going into the storm from deep layers of moisture, and that this rain gets deposited over a very small area, which is usually you get the flooding events when it occurs, when it's at the top of a valley area or at the top of an area where you don't have much permeable surface, such as in a city.
So, Gail, can you tell us about what you remember about weather during your time living there in Middleton, 75 yards from the creek?
Well, when I first came to Wisconsin some years back, I won't say how many, but I can remember very much during the winter, it was very common to have 10 days to 2 weeks of minus 20 weather during the winter. And that almost never happens anymore. And that's been a big change in terms of what I've noticed in the change. Yeah, the summers have definitely gotten warmer and stickier over time. And so I've personally felt the changes over the last, say, 50 years. And so I really mean, Ralph, why are things so different now than they were, 50 years ago around here?
Thank you, Gail. That's a very good question, and they have changed. They have changed dramatically. I can remember as a kid lying in bed with the windows open, no air conditioning, listening to the crickets at night, but in summer and remember much snowier winters. If we look at the documented history of the climate in Madison, we see that Madison has in fact gotten sweatier over the last 100 years. Our average, as you can see in the upper left panel, the average temperature in Madison by decade, so this is not just looking at 1 year or the next, but over a longer period, our average temperature has increased by almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is really important when you consider that the period before 1950 may have been abnormally warm because in this record, because the observation point was at North Hall on campus, while after 1950 it moved to the airport, which is a much colder location. So we saw a decrease in the temperatures in the 50s and then increased temperatures thereafter. The major change, however, if you look in the lower right panel, shows the change, the more recent change in between the 2010s and the 30 years before that. And we can see that in May, June, July, September, October, we see a substantial warming, and these are the max and minimum temperature averages of 1 to 2 degrees. And in December, which we can't quite see on the edge of the slide, we see that there is in fact a major warming has occurred in December. And in February, we have cooling. And in April, we have a little bit of cooling. So we're having a shift in our winter to be a little bit later in the year, but an extended warmer fall and especially into the December time period. Look at the next slide. This will show it in the annual precipitation amounts. If we look at again over the last decade, so since 1900, we can see that our average precipitation has increased from about 31 inches to almost 36 inches for the last decade. That's a substantial increase in the amount of precipitation. And if we look on the left panel, we can see in the year-to-year differences that you had up above normal and below normal when you compare it to the 100-year average through much of the 20th century. But since about 1980, we're seeing very few drier years than normal and many more wetter years than normal.
Well, I can add a little bit more about the changes in the temperatures. I can remember when my children were growing up in the 70s and the 80s when we were living in Shorewood Hills. They used to flood the baseball diamond there in the winter in time for the kids to be able to use it as an ice skating rink over Christmas break. Well, that has become more and more difficult and more unpredictable now. Definite change. And then there was this wonderful charity event that was many years was out on Lake Monona, Kites on Ice. And it was quite a fun event and it was a nice charity event. Well, they had to stop that because they could no longer count on the ice being there. So these are two, just examples of how it has affected our everyday lives.
Yes, I remember growing up again near Lake Geneva, watching the ice boat races on Lake Geneva, which haven't happened anymore because there's not enough ice. The ice isn't thick enough. It's not old enough and hard enough to be racing.
Mhm.
If we look at again the record of the observation record from Madison and look at the next slide, this is in the light green is the average precipitation for every month through the year over the last 40 years. The gray, the gray is the change in snowfall that we've seen in the last decade versus the previous 3 decades before that. And you can see this distinct decrease in snowfall of almost 3.5 inches less snowfall in December in the recent decade, and an increase by almost 3 inches in February. That is shifting our snowfalls towards midwinter, not early winter. We also see that there's an increase in precipitation in April, May, June, and then again in September and October with a little bit more in August. But these months that were quite a large precip have become larger, substantially larger. And if you look at the fall flooding events, you can look at October. In the last decade, there was almost a 50% increase in precipitation. You'll also notice in January that it's small. We don't get that much precipitation in January. Our snowfall is becoming less, but we actually are getting more precipitation. That means we're getting more rain in January than we have in the past. So it's a shift in precipitation type. Now, you can ask the question, what is happening in the flooding question? So let's go to the next slide. Madison is not only getting soggier and sweatier, it's also getting stickier. And important, this is your physics lesson for the day, is that as climate change is increasing our temperature, we're also increasing the amount of moisture, the amount of water vapor that the atmosphere can hold and transport from one place to another. And it's a nonlinear change. For every 1 degree Fahrenheit increase that you have in temperature, the atmosphere can hold about 3.5% times more moisture. So that's saying that on a warm day in September, if it's 5 degrees warmer than average, the atmosphere can be holding 15% more moisture than average, which means that if that moisture has to go someplace, what goes up has to come down, and that 15% increased moisture in the atmosphere will be changed into about a 15% increase in areal average rainfalls. And if there are slow-moving storms, that can really magnify the amount of precipitation even further in local areas as this deep influx of moisture from the Gulf of Mexico up through the wetter states to the south transports moisture into our storms. Next slide. Next slide, please. So sort of a summary of, yes, Madison is getting sweatier. We've warmed by almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the beginning of the 1900s. We are getting wetter in terms of precipitation. As I said, in the early 1900s, the first half of the 1900s, we were averaging about 31 inches of rainfall. In the 2010s, we were averaging close to 37 inches of rainfall. And equally as important, on the bottom slide here, we're showing that the frequency of the number of days per year when you have more than 1 inch of rain. If you're going to have flooding, you need to have a large amount of rainfall. And it is showing that from 1940 through about 1980, we were averaging about between 5 and 6 days per year of rainfall more than 1 inch. We're now averaging about 10 to 11 days per year with rainfall more than 1 inch. this has multiple effects because it not only provides more rain, it also makes the soil wetter. So when it rains, the soil can absorb less and more rain will be run off. And it also allows more local warming, moistening of the atmosphere. So we don't just depend upon the inflow of moisture that's evaporated over the Gulf of Mexico. We have a local source of moisture from evaporation.
So thank you very much, Ralph. It's my understanding that the recycling of rainfall goes the best where there are lots of plants. So with all this increased sogginess and sweatiness coming our way, we're hoping for plants to help us out. Greg, can you talk a little bit about this strategy and how it's been implemented at the Holy Wisdom Prairie?
Yes, the sisters, the Benedictine sisters at Holy Wisdom Monastery have care for the earth as a part of their mission. And the main way in which they have decided to do that is through ecological restoration. And they started back in the 1990s, 1996 to be specific, restoring Prairie. And over the years, they have restored 126 acres of prairie, 33 of those acres since 2014. And we're also working on about a 30-acre restoration of oak opening savanna. And there's also about a 20-acre woodland, all of which are fire communities in that they will have fire going through them on a fairly regular basis. So this, previous to the time when they started doing the prairie restorations, this was all agricultural land, and there were tremendous erosion gullies that had developed down through those fields. And I've heard from some of the old timers around here that every time there was a good rainstorm, water would run right up over the top of Highway M, surrounding and adjacent to where those fields were. And then they planted the prairie, and the prairie developed in there, and all of these perennial plants that had these deep root systems slowed the movement of the water. And there was they actually put in a stormwater detention basin kind of at the bottom of that area. And for the first couple of years, there was some water that would got down into that stormwater detention basin. But after that, the water was absorbed and slowed down so much that there wasn't any water in that stormwater detention basin any longer. And certainly there was no water running over the top of Highway M. So it was really a dramatic change in what happened. And I think as just a kind of an anecdotal demonstration of how important it can be to restore, put back the native vegetation, the native ecological communities. I mean, it isn't just the plants, it's also the animals and the microorganisms and all the other things that go along with that. So, it's been a wonderful experience for the people at the monastery, and I think that a lot of the people in this kind of Middleton, Westport area really appreciate what the sisters have done. And by the way, we have this wonderful Friends organization called the Friends of Wisdom Prairie, and I think that's another way in which people can come and do something to make conditions better, is to join organizations like that.
Mm.
Friends of Pheasant Branch too.
Yes, community support for all these efforts is so important. And the tragedy of these flooding events is dramatic, but they also can be used to galvanize community support for the kinds of efforts that need to be done. And I can give you two examples. One would be the stormwater utility in Middleton. Now, they started out in 2010 to develop a plan to manage stormwater going into the lake in Middleton. And they were able to pass a referendum to add a charge to the water bills in 2014 to help with the stormwater management. And that people overwhelmingly supported paying money through their water bills to develop better stormwater planning. And then after this major storm in 2018, another referendum was passed in 2019 in Middleton to substantially increase the amount of money that would be paid through the water fees. And both of these things were overwhelmingly passed. I mean, 80% of the people approved increasing their tax bill or their water bill in order to pay for the kind of mitigation efforts that were necessary. And then the other example is, there was a dairy farm adjacent, immediately north of Pheasant Branch. And the county did buy that 160 acres in 2019. And they're working now on restoring that to Prairie. And this is a wonderful area because there was a lot of runoff from that whole farming area. And so what will happen now is they will plant it into Prairie. It'll take several years, and there are many steps that are involved. And one of them is taking down the buildings and crushing the cement to use it for paths. But in the end, that prairie will absorb much more rainwater, and it will reduce the runoff into the creek, into Lake Mendota, and increase the water quality in both of those areas. So these are two really good examples of how important it is for community support of these efforts.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. I think this also prompts us to remember that flooding impacts farms and food production as well as the kinds of areas we've been talking about. Our Ag Stewardship Forum that we had earlier this year highlighted the importance of planning and adaptation by farmers to deal with the current floods that we've already and the future floods. So I'm hoping that each of you can give us a little words to live by, a little last message from your point of view before we wrap up. So maybe Ralph first.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. And thank both Gail and Greg for their inputs, because it's very important for scientists to know what the net effect and what possible mitigation efforts can be made to help us survive climate change. Regarding climate change and flooding, it's all about moisture. We have to remember that climate change is not just warming. Warming means we can have moisture atmospheres, that we have warmer oceans that evaporate more moisture into the atmosphere, that will give us more intense hurricanes that behave in different ways than they have in the past. But also this increased moisture can be the fuel for localized flooding, where that moisture can be transported thousands of miles away from its original source to produce the flooding. But it's important also to remember that the flooding won't occur every year, that there will be drought years yet, which will have effect on agriculture. There will be very wet years that can have effects on agriculture. But in those drought years, moisture still has to go someplace, and it's going to go someplace else. And those places are going to get more moisture, just as we have been getting more moisture, possibly due to other places being in semi-drought. Time will tell.
Greg, any comments?
Well, I think restoring or preserving natural lands not only is important because it is sustaining biological diversity, also restoring kind of ecological services such as stormwater retention and infiltration. But it's also beautiful. Prairies, I hope that some of the people that live in this area might come out and visit the monastery and see the prairies when they're in flower. Right now, we've got prairie flax and we've got coreopsis, and there are lots of other spiderwort and whatnot that are just wonderful. The beauty of nature. That was the way in which I think I first got involved in caring about the world around me. Was when I was a child and I was in a wetland and looking at it was a spring, and a family of leatherback turtles swam silently below my face. And it was one of those moments that just influenced the rest of my life, in that it was so beautiful and so moving. And I hope that maybe doing this ecological restoration is going to help to provide a habitat for those beautiful turtles and many other beings that I like to share the world with.
Oh, thanks for that, Greg. I can almost see it in my mind, my version of it anyway. Thanks for that very much. And Gail?
Well, I loved that picture that Greg showed of the people out seeding for the prairie. You know, sometimes you can get really discouraged that there is nothing that we can do to sort of deal with these problems, these overwhelming climate change. But we can do, on an individual basis, we can do something. And most of these, Wisdom Prairie has a friends group, Friends of Pheasant Branch, and you can go out and you can with these groups, and you can collect seeds, you can throw out seeds, you can clear invasives, and these are just important activities. The Friends of Pheasant Branch are just vital to the health of the Conservancy because of the amount of work that they're willing to do to go out and plant and clear. And friends, almost all the county parks have some kind of a friends group. And I would just encourage people to look into these things and to realize that on an individual basis, there is something that we can do to really help this problem.
Indeed. Thanks, Gail. And we'll also note that in between the last forum about the marshes and this current forum that we're recording today, the action of citizens influenced the Madison City Council to pass a very beneficial stormwater ordinance. So that's another kind of thing that we can do. So just to wrap up here, I would like to thank very much all of our participants, Ralph and Gail and Greg. Thanks very much for your perspectives. I believe that there's going to be a list of actions you can take come up at the very, very end of this virtual forum. So I'll just say goodbye and thank you very much.